What's going on, guys? Joshua Gibson here with episode 18 of the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. Today, I am starting a new series called the Coach's Corner, and the first guest I have is Coach Wil Fleming. So Wil boasts a pretty impressive resume. He's played many sports, finding success as a hammer thrower, weightlifter, and now a performance and weightlifting coach. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Wil, how are we doing?
Excellent, man. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no problem. And for our listeners that don't know much about you, could you give us an idea of where you come from and how you got where you are?
Yeah, definitely. I started. This goes back 20 years now, where I was an athlete and playing sports growing up, and can remember really distinctly a play in football where I just got run over by a guy and decided, man, I'm not big and strong enough. So I looked around and said, hey, where does that guy work out? And I found out that he lifted at a certain place. And so I went over there and asked them if they could make me a better football player. And they said, yeah, we can, but we're an Olympic weightlifting club. So you're going to have to compete in, this snatch and clean and jerk. And I said, whatever it takes, And so that kind of started, that was just over 20 years ago now. And I had the opportunity to lift under some really good coaches, and that got me on the Olympic weightlifting side of things, and won a junior national championship in Olympic lifting, and after a couple years of lifting, and then because I was getting more athletic, I had an opportunity to have track scholarships and football scholarships, and ultimately lived at the Olympic Training Center for a period of time for weightlifting. Decided it wasn't for me at that time. 18-year-old me was really wanted that scholarship and stuff like that. So I ended up going and competing in track and field for 5 years at Indiana University, where they made me learn the hammer throw. Did that until the Olympic trials in 2008. Opened up a gym. I'm trying to give you the really short and condensed version, so if I'm missing stuff, but opened a gym in 2008 and started coaching athletes, on the performance side of things, and just had some athletes at that time, around 2010, where, they were good athletes, but they weren't going to get recruited and all that kind of stuff. And maybe they were, their first one that I ever coached in weightlifting was a 56 kilo athlete. And he just, wanted to be a soccer player, but, he's like 5'4" and 57 kilos. So it was like, hey, this isn't going to happen. So I told him about weightlifting. We started going to meets together. And since then, our club's really grown, and we've got, almost 50 weightlifters in our club, and won youth national championships. We've won junior national championships, university national championships, no senior national champions yet, and masters national championships. So, and then along the way, I started competing again as well. And so I get my competitive itch out. And so I still compete periodically in weightlifting, coach a lot, have the performance side of things where we have athletes of all sorts of sports going on. And we're all here in Bloomington, Indiana, which is, kind of just in the middle of a Midwest town,
Yeah, actually, I've been following your training for a while, and I noticed you've been hitting some really nice PRs lately. So are those all-time PRs?
Yeah, so I have in college, I got really big and strong when I was a hammer thrower, but I was weighing, 100 kilos plus. So I was, 220, 225 and stuff like that. So I'd done some more max lifts, but, it was like a block snatch. I did 145 when I was really big. And then I did a clean or power clean from the blocks of 182 when I was, about 100 kilos. So yeah, now I compete at 85 kilos, and so the all-time best clean and jerk, all-time best snatches, minus just a couple things where I was huge, right? Really big, which I'm not normally that big.
Right. And before we kind of dive into all that, I do have a question I like to ask everyone that comes on. As far as the training goes, what is the most difficult aspect for you and then for people that you coach?
Yeah, I think this is for everybody, is like maybe expectations and approach to training, right? I think this could go for me. And I think it's one of the biggest things that I've done in the last year that has made me more successful than I have been personally, like in terms of my own competition. But it's just those expectations, whether they're just dialing them into the right thing. Like what is appropriate in terms of PRing? How often should I do it? What happens if I don't? And like that adjustment to time schedule, because everybody gets hooked on weightlifting because of weightlifting kind of secret that in the first couple months, every time you go in the gym, you PR, right?
Yeah.
I remember sitting down with my coach when I was like 15 and said, coach, I've gone up 10 kilos in the clean and jerk in the last week. I was just thinking if I just do, 1 kilo a training session, I'll be at the world record in, just a couple years. And he's like, yeah, that's going to stop, at some point. But there's that time scale where it goes like every day and then every week and then it's every month. And that's still okay for some people. But then when you start talking about the order 12 weeks or 16 weeks or every year you PR, those expectations. And so when you have the wrong expectations, training can get really frustrating. That's why I quit weightlifting in the first time. Was I had won the junior national championship in weightlifting, and then for 2 meets after that, I totaled the exact same thing, right? Which isn't bad. Like I actually totaled on my openers in a couple of those meets, right? So I was definitely getting stronger, but it was just frustration because I didn't hit a PR. I didn't have the number, and that's just a really weird expectation. I was still the best junior in the country. I was still hitting numbers at the upper echelon of what I had done, but I was like, oh, I'm frustrated because I didn't PR, right? So dealing with those expectations. And so that's the thing that I've done in the past year that's been really successful is just like, hey, you got to love the training process. Just like even, whatever it is about that process that you like, whether it's putting on your shoes and then the warming up and all that kind of stuff, but just buying into that and loving it.
Right. So kind of in that same vein, would you say that's the most difficult aspect of coaching as well, is keeping people kind of dialed into their expectations and not always trying to go for a PR and go for a big lift, but just trust the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think like getting them to understand the process, because there's a weird gray zone when your athletes when they're really young, they're like, whatever you say, coach, right? And then when they've been doing it a long time, maybe they have some own self-reflection. But it's when they first start going, I have a thought about how this should go, right? And making them just trust the process so that they're there and they're cool with that, and they know that this 2 sets of 3 at 70% that we have today, which I really want to go heavier on. I really wish that I could go heavier on, but knowing that 2 sets of 3 at 70% is actually going to help them reach their goal in 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever.
Right. So you kind of talked about your entire background. So through that time, who would you say has had the biggest influence on you as a coach?
Yeah, I mean, my first coaches were awesome, right? Like I was really fortunate when I walked into that gym when I was 15. One of my coaches was a guy named Frank Exton, who went on to become the president of USA Weightlifting. So he's a really, really great coach. Paul Fleschler was another coach of mine who was a 1992 Olympian, ended up as the men's national team coach at the Olympic Training Center. So those were really impactful on me, and they were just, technically super great coaches and all that kind of stuff. I've also had like great track and field coaches and just how they try and connect with the people. I always tell my athletes that my number one goal as their coach is to get invited to their wedding one day, right? It's not necessarily like, it's not, I mean, I want them to achieve all that they can, but I want them to know that I'm there for them, and that if I get invited to their wedding, that meant I did what I was supposed to do, right? They might not have been a junior world champion or something like that, but maybe that wasn't in the cards. The point was that I was there for them when they needed me. They could call me, and if they're having troubles, they could send me a text. I'm going to support them in the gym when they're here, and hopefully make a really positive impact. So a lot of coaches that did stuff like that for me have been really awesome. One of my coaches in track and field in college was just, really, really nice guy, and that's what I want to be. I want to be a nice coach who impacts them. And then, so, then you build your network, and Outside of that, guys like Greg Everett and Mike McKenna are really good friends of mine who are awesome coaches. But I can bounce stuff off them because that technical development that happens daily, right? The way I approach coaching is where I've been most influenced by coaches in my past.
Okay, awesome. And I've actually never heard it kind of phrased like that. That's really fascinating to think of, because obviously we all want to connect with our athletes. We all want them to trust us, because in order to kind of help them reach their peak of success, they have to buy in. And like you said, you want to support them as much as you can, whether that's with life stress, training stress, whatever it is. So I absolutely love that. So
yeah,
to kind of go with your coaching philosophy a little bit more, I'd like to kind of run through like a case study. So imagine that we have a new athlete walk into your gym, and I'm going to assume this kid is like 20 years old, like a typical beginner weightlifter that kind of comes in with a little bit of weight training experience, but maybe didn't play any formal sports, or not a lot of them. Could you take us through the process first of kind of developing their technique, and then we'll go on from there?
Yeah. So the first thing, because we have the kind of performance background, everybody would go through an assessment of some sort. And so in the most basic sense, you could picture it as like a functional movement screen. And then we add a couple tests like of shoulder function and hip function, and just kind of just evaluating their movement characteristics and movement capabilities. And that'll give us an idea of like, hey, they shouldn't even go overhead because their shoulders are just wrecked right now because they've benched for 5 straight years and now they want to switch to Olympic lifting, right? So we would do something like that, and we would start on that side of things, go with a movement assessment, and then let's say they're all clear. I mean, if they're not all clear, we'll kind of develop some mobility and warm up and figure out what things they can actually do, and use that as our basis. If they're all clear, then and they have some weight training experience or weightlifting experience, we'll start just going through the movements. And I usually teach from a top-down progression. And it's not necessarily like I have to teach them in my way to do it. Like if they've lifted a CrossFit and they have a good basis in Olympic lifting, but they need to work on it. It's not so much that I need to teach them to start over or anything like that. I just want to have a common language, right? So I'm talking about the hip position and flat feet and what above the knee looks like and all that kind of stuff, so that when I start programming variations and stuff like that, they know what I want out of that. So we'll go through our progression, and I'll usually address where I see some weaknesses. So if they have really poor mechanics off the floor, we'll do a lot of stuff where we pull and pause above the knee, where we complete the first pull. If they're off balance at the top of the lift, we'll start do more things from above the knee. And then we just usually design a program based on that kind of stuff, where my goal is to correct as many things as possible with the movements that I program, as opposed to my words, right? So we think about having 3 levels of coaching that we can do in the gym. The first one is like an internal cue where we're talking about squeeze the lats or something with the athlete, where they're thinking about a body part or whatever. The second level would be an external cue where we're talking about the result, and the third level is just program it away in the movement or environment. So if I can do that, that's the easiest way that I can get a result. So we try and program that way, and then build the program there with just basic periodization past that.
So with the cueing, have you noticed a difference between experience level of the athlete and then kind of which cue they respond best to, whether that's external or internal?
Yeah, absolutely. At all levels, I'm going to try to program it away with a movement or the environment. With my beginner kids, so we have lifters from like 12 years old to 55, right? So, and the ones that have been lifting for 2 or 3 years, I can start saying, use your lats to squeeze the bar back, or rotate the knuckles down or something like that. Those little things can have some impact. But if I say that to like my 12-year-old or my master's athlete who's just like getting into weightlifting, I am just setting them up for disaster. So I try to use those really sparingly and only with the athletes who I know can handle it.
Okay, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, you have to have some sort of experience to even know how to contract a lat. So like
Yeah, right.
some people use like these general cues and yell them out, and like the lifter doesn't even know maybe even what the muscle is, sometimes. So I think that's smart to try and use movements to correct deficiencies. So as far as like the most common technical faults, are there any you encounter more frequently than others?
Yeah. So the biggest technical fault is has something to do with balance, right? Because we always talk about the worst like technical correction ever in weightlifting is you jumped forward, right? Because it's like, well, why did I jump forward? But you hear that sometimes. Well, that one was wrong because you jumped forward. Well, I know that. That's like telling me you have a runny nose, you're sick, right?
Right.
That's a symptom. So, but something along that line, to fix that, there is some error in balance at some point in the lift. So, as soon as I identify that, hey, we have something going on, we're gonna look at what their balance is like at any given point. And I think that like if you think about the lift, I want the athlete balanced across the whole foot for the whole time, minus the final extension, right? So they should pull from the whole foot. On their first pull, they should start initiating the second pull from their whole foot. They finish through their toes and then they receive it on their whole foot. And if I see any deviations from that, then we've had some error in balance at some point in the lift. So I'm going to go back and look at that, and that can happen anytime, right? They could set up too far over, they could set up too far on their heels, right? And they could pull around the knees. They could shoot the knees too far back and get on their heels at that point. And all those errors in balance will cause some sort of technical deficiency later. So really, we're looking at like one of the biggest guiding light principles that we have in our weightlifting is if my toes come off the ground, if my heels come off the ground, we did something wrong. And so people can almost self-coach themselves by just keeping their whole foot in contact with the ground the whole time.
Yeah. I notice sometimes that can come from like those extreme cues that may be misunderstood. Like when someone yells heels, people think like, okay, I need to shift my weight completely back on my heels, when maybe it's just a correction because someone's too far on their toes. And do you come into contact, like, do you experience that a lot with your lifters? Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really valuable, like say heels, right? Because they're always on their toes, right? Yeah. You almost think, as a coach, you almost go, if I overcorrect it, maybe it'll get to the middle ground where I want it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so you'll hear that kind of stuff, heels, stuff like that. And so, I think that's like one thing in coaching is that it's okay to overcorrect something as long as you know that the middle ground is probably where we want to be, right?
Right. So you kind of talk about in the pull, balance on the full foot. Now, as far as like the dip and drive for the jerk goes, are you kind of along that same lines? You want balance on the midfoot or full foot?
Yeah, it's probably going to be, I mean, we're talking about, a difference of 5 and 10% of like weight balance and stuff like that. It's still midfoot because I think it's it's better to like connect everything. But if we put a force plate under the foot, you're going to see that the weight is a little more towards the heels on good jerks, right? Mm-hmm. Just because when we dip, we want the hips to remain over, on top of the heels as opposed to drifting forward at all. And if you go totally midfoot, you're probably going to have your hips drift a little bit.
Okay, interesting. So now, I'm assuming you use a lot of variations, like you said, to correct faults. So what are some underrated variations of the lift that you find have the greatest impact on your athlete's technique or performance?
Yeah, so we think about our variations in terms of what they can affect, right? Whether that's bar height, whether that's their ability to get under, time to fixation, or trajectory, right? So we want to think about what keeps the bar close and all that kind of stuff. So I like positional variations a lot because I think that's positional and pauses primarily. Pauses will give us better trajectory usually, right? So I'll bring the bar, pause above the knee, so that I complete my first pull and make, my early contact on the thigh so that I can slide through it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to help trajectory. And then that's also going to help like our pull height, right? So pauses above the knee are huge for us. We'll use some no contact stuff for trajectory or time to fixation so that people get under faster. We'll I'll keep it in my back pocket, but we use stuff like no feet here and there. But usually I like to keep my biggest variations are going to be in the positions we pause, and the combinations we'll put together, like pull plus clean, pull plus snatch, all that kind of stuff, so that we get almost more elastic. Because one other thing we want to look at for our athletes is developing whether we develop strength or elasticity, right? So we look at athletes early on, a comparison of their counter movement jump versus their static vertical jump, and if the difference is too large towards the counter movement jump is over 10% greater than the non-counter movement jump, those athletes are probably too elastic. They need a little more strength. And if it's really close together, those athletes need more elasticity. So we'll do more variations from the hang. We'll do more box jumps and stuff like that.
So I have a question, and it's just something I've heard from other weightlifting coaches. They tend not to use pause squats, maybe for the impact that it could have on the clean, kind of catching the bounce. What are your thoughts on variations of the squats, and do you often implement them with your athletes?
Yeah, so we'll usually we'll use pauses or tempos early in a training program when I want like greater time under tension, right? So maybe it's because I still lift quite a bit, but 10s and 8s and stuff like that and squats are just the worst thing that anybody could do to me. So I'll change the tempo so that we have a similar time under tension. So it might be sets of 5 with a 3-second pause on the first one. So maybe I have a similar tempo to a set of 8 or something like that. So we'll use them as a variation just to get us more time under tension. But I don't necessarily think it has too much of a negative impact. I'll use them a lot, actually, if athletes are injured or have poor squat mechanics. The idea of like that butt wink thing, where somebody might have an unstable pelvis, I'll pause squats a lot, because then they have to feel that position a little more, and it's a little less impactful on the body if they pause that first rep or pause every rep or something like that. But I'm not shy about them. Once we get closer to competition, squatting's almost secondary to us, right? So we'll just do our triples or do our sets of 5 and almost be done with it, as opposed to worrying about which variation we use too much. And honestly, once I've worked with an athlete long enough, if they tell me they love pause squat variations, we'll keep them in there because they like them and it gives them confidence in their training.
Right, and that's really interesting with the tempo squats. I've never actually considered it as a way to bypass higher rep training. I'm definitely gonna put that in my back pocket.
Yeah, and we'll do all sorts of stuff so that it doesn't feel like higher rep training. We'll do like clusters of squats. So we'll do 3, rest 20 seconds, 3 more, rest 20 seconds, do that kind of stuff. We'll do slow eccentric first one and stuff like that. So just anything to not have to do, because really those longer, obviously the extra muscle contractions do some of the work, but time under tension is also a variable that we can play with that can create a pretty similar result.
Sure. Excellent. And you've kind of delved into it already. So basically, how would you summarize your style of programming? And maybe if you could give us a few main principles you like to work around.
Yeah. So when I really have after an athlete's gone through and they had enough exposure to the lifts and all that kind of stuff, and they've probably done some really classical periodization, staying in that a lot of reps at 70 to 79% and then bumping it to 80 to 85 and all that kind of stuff. And they've had some real exposure. That's almost like base building and getting the athlete kind of prepared and all that kind of stuff. My big philosophy is the trying to do the minimal effective dose of training to get the greatest result. So and that and honestly, a lot of times I think that's like frequent training in short durations. So for myself, for instance, I will train 6 days a week, but each session is like a max of 45 minutes. Now that really helps. I'm a master's athlete and all that kind of stuff, so it allows me to recover. But and that really just started from I kind of just had a 4-day program that I was going to do and get ready for a meet. And, I'd do it and, it'd look really classical. You'd, clean and then you'd squat and maybe you'd pull and all that kind of stuff. And by the end of one day, I was just totally wrecked over and over and over. Right. No matter how much time, if I did day on, day off, day on, day off, day on, day on, whatever, I would get totally wrecked. And so I just took the same number of exercises and split it up over 6 days instead of 4, and thinking, well, I'm actually have less rest, but I really the what we're after at some point after we have a technical base is we're after a stimulus to our body, right? We want a stimulus that our body can recover from, and then have super compensation and get better. And so that stimulus, if I can keep that stimulus small enough that I can recover every single time I can train, I can have really, really good results. So this past spring, when I was getting ready for Masters Nationals, I took 12 weeks, did this minimal effective dose training 6 days a week, and through 66 training sessions, right? So through 11 weeks, the last week being kind of a peak, I improved on the previous week's result. So Monday was snatch, Tuesday was clean and jerk, Wednesday was squat, Thursday was snatch, Friday was clean and jerk, Saturday was squat. I improved on the previous week's results in 62 of those training sessions. Wow. Right? So yeah, and I kept the there's another thing that's kind of a track and field thing from Anatoly Bondarchuk, is the more consistent you keep your training in terms of like reps, exercises, and whatnot, the faster you can attain a peak, right? The more you put variation in there, the more often you will, the longer it'll take for you to peak, right? So I stayed super consistent to the almost identical training sessions Monday through Saturday, but just tried to add a couple kilos, 1 to 2 kilos every week. And so I went from a snatch triple best of 110 to a triple of 126. I went from a clean and jerk 2+2 of 140 to 155. My squat went from 170 by 5 for 200 to 200 by 5. So each week I was just adding kilos because the stimulus at any given time was not great enough that I couldn't recover from it for the next training session. So with a lot of my athletes, we try to do this minimal effective dose so that they can recover and feel really good for the next session. And so that's a primary idea behind what I want to do in training, is find out what that minimal effective dose is for an athlete. So for me as a master's athlete, I figured out it's like 1 lift a day, 6 days a week. For a lot of my university and junior university level athletes, that might be 2 or 3 things a day, but it's snatch and pull and a bunch of accessories and clean and pull and squat one day maybe, so finding out that minimal effective dose so that I can get the best effect, and that's going to accommodate for athletes. A lot of times we take our training and look at what really successful nations have done, and then say, well, I'll make it a little lighter and I'll change it in some way, but a lot of times they've been doping, so we're not able to actually have any clue what you can actually do. So this is kind of a way to back it all the way up, start 1 lift a day, and then and then build off of that until we find out ideally what would work.
So there's been a push, I don't know if it's been as of late, but a lot of people want to kind of push more away from that minimum effective dose and more towards that like maximum recoverable dose, and like implement overreaching strategies and stuff like that. Now, have you found there's a benefit to maybe doubling the volume a couple weeks before, like a deload or a taper, or do you think it's more of like an injury risk? Like, have you ever tried using those methods?
Yeah. So I mean, in any like training, what we'll typically do is this kind of idea has a couple different things. So one is minimum effective dose, but at the beginning we set our thresholds for training, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just take mine for instance, right? So my week one numbers in snatch triple is a 110, and so that is my threshold, right? I want every week to exceed that in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So in week two, typically that would be try to snatch 112 or 113 for a triple. In week three, I might go, I might say, I don't care about the PR. I just want to get more volume. So I'll hit 110 for two triples or three triples. And then and then I'll kind of, that'll be how I achieve the stimulus in a slightly different fashion. So in a lot of our training sessions, what we'll do is set it up and say, here's your threshold. Week two, try to beat it. Week three, week two, try to beat it with intensity or volume. And some of my athletes react better to more volume, and some of them get a better stimulus from more intensity. And so we'll kind of choose that based on the athlete and what we've done in the past. And then once we have that week three, that'll be our down week. And then week four, we try to beat intensity and volume. So 113 for two triples, right? Or something like that, as opposed to 110 for two triples or whatever. So week three is usually our deload week. And then week three is where we try and hit intensity and volume on it.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So do you think there are any changes that just like our listeners could put in immediately to kind of make their program more effective, whether that's through like a loading strategy, or I guess you kind of alluded to one right there, is just like adding sets or adding weight. I think a lot of people find that it's one or the other.
Yeah.
Have you found anything that's kind of worked for you?
Well, the thing that I would say, like, that maybe frames your training in a better way, that and this goes back maybe to the very first question, the very first thing we started talking about, is identify your PRs in any number of rep schemes of the things that you commonly do, right? Whether that's, and like, so, through all that variation that we talked about, like, let's start with these variations, da 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 da. I want to identify the variations that affect your training the best, right? And once you have those identified and you have a couple rep schemes for them, then identify your best, whether it's a snatch triple or a hang snatch double or snatch from blocks or whatever that is, identify your best. And then you would start your training by saying, on a good day in training is achieving 85% of my best in that lift, right? So, if my best snatch triple or best clean and jerk triple is 120, I should have chosen an easier number, but we would do, 102, right? That's 85% of my best clean and jerk triple. I'm going to use that. If I hit 102 in a clean and jerk triple, then that's a good day of training, and then just build off of that, right? So use that threshold, and on a day you feel like crap, you could still come in and hit 85% of your rep best on something, right? Most likely, right? And you might have 1 or 2 days like that in a training cycle where you can't hit it. And it's fine because it's 1 or 2 days in your training cycle. But if you are always hitting and then slightly exceeding that 85% number, you're going to have a ton of progress over a long time. And you're also, if you frame your training around that threshold, it's going to be a much more positive experience, right? Because one of the things we know about training is just the consistency and repeatability and coming in and doing it over and over and over. That's how we get better, right? So if there's days you come in and you have a bad training session and the next day your mind's out of it because you're thinking about yesterday's training session, now you've ruined, now 2 training sessions are in the tank and now we're going backwards, right? So we want to be able to consistently come back in and hit those numbers. So we train at thresholds a lot, which is 85% of a rep best is usually that threshold number. And we just want to hit that number or exceed it slightly as we move, in a 12-week preparation block towards competition.
Right. That's excellent. That was a phenomenal answer. So I have a couple like movements and then styles of programming I want to ask you about and kind of get your opinion on them. So heavy deadlifts, do you think they ever have a place in a weightlifter's training, and would you ever use them?
Gosh, to be quite honest, I've never deadlifted more than I can clean, right? I mean, I've clean pulled, right? And it's just how I came up, right?
Mm-hmm.
We never did it. It might have a place in some people's training. I've used it for some people who just look super weak off the floor. We'll start doing stuff. But we call them clean deadlifts because I want them to look identical and all that kind of stuff. The traditional deadlift is just so hard. If we're doing something totally like kind of, we've had some athletes do like super total programs,
Mm-hmm.
and I make them sumo deadlifts so that it doesn't affect their clean pull at all, right? So, I mean, I would say there's no bad exercises overall to put in a program, but there might be people who those are, contraindicated towards. They have had a history of back problems and that sort of thing. But they're not my favorite. But you can't argue with the fact that, like, I've seen a video of Kendrick Ferris like deadlift 250 for 10, and then he can just like static start and pull 215 clean and jerks and stuff like that. So who knows, right? I mean, obviously it has a place in training. I just haven't figured out the ideal place yet.
Sure. Okay. So the next movement would be like a box squat. Do you implement those? And if you do, why?
I don't. I mean, in our general population and stuff and our general population will do like squat 2 box to let them learn a depth of squatting.
Mm-hmm.
But that traditional west side box squat, unload your hips and stuff like that, I went through a phase where I did those, and I didn't find much transferability to Olympic lifts or sports, to be quite honest.
Sure. And I guess whenever we're talking about movements, it's all about the transfer of training. I mean, if it's not 100%. Directly impacting your snatch or clean and jerk, it really is just causing unnecessary fatigue and then impacting the way you can move or load other movements.
100%. Yep.
So as far as styles of programming go, have you ever implemented like a squat every day program, or do you typically just stick with like a 2 to 3 times per week?
I've done it all. I've done in my own life, I've done Russian squat. I've done small love. I've, squatted every day, tried to squat to up to a circa max or whatever. Right. And the most effective thing that I've ever done is doing squatting less frequently, like max of 2 days a week. But on both days, I will front squat and back squat.
Okay.
So as opposed to just doing like front squat here, back squat here, front squat here, back squat here. And I will do front squat so on day 1, I would front squat for volume and then back squat for intensity. So maybe it's 6 sets of 3 in the front squat, and then a 3 rep max back squat, or a 2 rep max back squat, or a 1 rep max back squat. And then on another day, I would back squat for volume and then front squat for intensity. And that has been the most effective thing that I've ever done personally for my squats and for a ton of my athletes. Now, some athletes, when they're younger, will squat 4 or 5 times a week, but at low intensities, almost like 80% for triples and stuff like that in one heavy day. And that can kind of help athletes along the way as they're coming in. But the most effective thing I've done is squat less frequently, but do both front squats and back squats on the same day.
I've never actually heard of that. So I'm kind of curious as to how you stumbled upon that kind of style of squatting.
So there is a squat program by a guy named Justin Thacker, who's a good friend of mine out in St. Louis. And he and I were coaching at the Olympic Training Center for a master's camp a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And he was telling me about this squat program he invented. And this is actually maybe going to maybe this conversation will spur Justin to finally release this to the public. But he called it Squatimus Prime, and was telling me about it. And it is like, it's front squat and back squat on the same day, but it's like, it's even more, right? It's like 3 days a week you do that. And, it's for rep max here and then 7 back offsets and all that kind of stuff. And he was like, this is amazing. And so I had a kid who had a broken arm, who was a weightlifter, and I said, hey, Justin, can you share it with me? And so he shared it with me. And this kid's squat went like just bananas. He went from 215 back squat at 90 kilos to like a 285 back squat in like 15 weeks or something like that. And just doing this, just squatting 3 days a week and doing both every day. And so I was like, well, I can't do that. And I don't like squatting every day because my knees like just I'm old, so my knees start hurting. So I just took that one element and said, well, I'll try that, and it worked really well. And I love that, because volume is really important. But it wasn't like, so my two volume days, one was 6x3 front squat and one was 5x5 back squat, and those were my volume days, or that was my kind of the volume stimulus. And then I would come back after that, immediately afterward, switch it out, and I would do a 3-rep max front squat after I'd back squat, just so I'd do it on tired legs kind of idea. And that was initially in my head was like, that's mental, right? I want to feel something heavy in the front squat after after my legs are tired, because in competition, maybe on my third clean and jerk, I'm going to be, feeling tired, and I want to feel, strong. So that was just kind of mental, and it really worked. That was the way I squatted to take, 5-rep max back squat from 170 at the time to 200, 3-rep max clean or front squat from 150 to 175. So it would just, I could recover from it. And that's what we were talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Minimal effective dose is, can I recover from it? And can I, continue to make progress? So that's been the most effective thing I've done.
Wow. That's great. I'm definitely going to start trying that with a few of my lifters, just to see kind of how they respond, because I kind of do that similar 2-day a week front squat, back squat. But yeah, I'll have to implement that. So thanks.
No problem.
Now, as far as longevity in the sport, kind of you talking about your knees kind of spurred this question on. What would you say was your biggest training mistake through your career? And not that it's over, but from when you started to now, have you encountered anything that's kind of really halted your progress quite a bit, or maybe made it more difficult to kind of give training your all?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the saying is, you in your 30s you pay for the mistakes of your teens and your 20s, right? So they're all in my 20s, right, when I was I was in college, and it was like lift heavy, and then let's go to happy hour, right? So that certainly didn't do a great number on my training at the time. And so there's obviously mistakes that a lot of people make like that. I think I was always trying to like keep up to date on the most advanced stuff. So when the first people used kettlebells, or so when RKC started in 2001 or something, I got a set of kettlebells, and I was swinging and swinging them and goblet squatting them and snatching them and all that kind of stuff pretty quick. So I was always trying to keep up to date on that stuff. First people were foam rolling, started foam rolling, so I always felt like that. But it was just never. I think that I went through that period where it was like, how heavy can I lift every single day? And that ultimately leads to breakdown, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's a phase that everybody wants to go through at some point. It's like, I feel like I'm pretty strong, so I'm gonna show myself or the world or the gym or my club that how strong I am right now, right? Mm-hmm. And so I just ultimately, weightlifting, if you are competing in weightlifting, your goal is to do it on the platform in a meet when it counts, and ideally in a national meet, and potentially in an international meet when it counts. Your gym lifts don't matter, right? Like they only matter if they allow you to lift more, in competition. And competition then is not a PR fest. Competition is a readiness check on how well you prepared, right? Because in no PR fest would you ever go on a 2-minute clock, and no PR fest would you ever go on a 15-minute wait. But if you have prepared well enough in competition to get ready for competition, and your readiness is high, then you can deal with any of those things. And so, Yeah, it's not your gym lifts, right? So I think that was probably that common mistake that a lot of people will have is like I was into my gym lifts too much and you know and I would I'd get hurt and train for 6 weeks and then get hurt and then all that kind of stuff. So you know kind of that's the evolution of where I am now, and what we started talking about is what can I recover from, what's the minimal effective dose, what's my
Sure.
threshold, what's going to keep me mentally in this the whole time, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really really wise because, like you were saying, you've done it all, and I think the fact that you've done it all makes you a very uh, someone that's going to be an excellent coach, right? Because if you haven't done it yourself, you're not going to be able to explain to someone why it will be a good or a bad idea, and how to keep them in check, because you've suffered the consequences from going too heavy too often, and I think the role of a good coach is to keep people from suffering those same consequences, and if you can't do that, you're not going to be a great coach.
Yep.
So, kind of finishing off the weightlifting part of this podcast, I do have some like abstract philosophical questions. So, besides physical improvements, do you think it's useful for everyone to resistance train, and what has adopting that habit done for you?
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's useful for everyone to resistance train. I just think that somebody told me this one time was just that they were like a CrossFit coach, and they said that they tell everybody the first time they come in that the first day they put 100 pounds over their head or lift 200 pounds from the floor, the smiles on their face will be payoff enough, right? Because I just think that confidence that comes with just feeling strong in your own body, right? And a lot of times in the fitness industry, people get wrapped up in like what your body looks like, right? Like there's people who will teach you how to market your fitness business based on preying upon the fact that people are unhappy with the way their body looks like. But I think that it's more. I think the coolest thing is what your body can do,
Right.
and resistance training kind of unlocks the potential of what your body can actually do.
Right. That's awesome. And typically, if you do train, your body's going to end up looking a lot better than
Yeah.
wherever you started.
Right. And there's like, there's tons of stuff like when you talk about aging and stuff like that, where the body of a 90-year-old who's been has been a lifelong resistance trainer, will be capable of and function as well as a 30-year-old who's never resistance trained.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's like 60 and 20 and 90 and 30 and stuff like that. So when you talk about longevity, if you do it the right way, you can set yourself up for a really cool life where you got kids, grandkids, and maybe even great grandkids that you can play with,
Right. That's awesome. So kind of going along that vein, what is one thing that our listeners can do each day to better their lives?
Oh man. I talk about my biggest thing, right? I have a priority list in my so maybe it's this, right? Is like create your priority list and base your life and your decisions around that priority list. And I'm talking about like real big things, right? So in my life, it's my faith, my family, my business, my coaching, and then my own lifting, right? So that's my 5 in order. So the first thing I do every day is get up and pray, right? And then the second thing I do is try and make breakfast for my family, right? So I got like, so 1 and 2, as soon as I get up, those are the things that I cover. And I'm really satisfied every day, right? Because I go to bed, and then I'm reading and I train and I get to coach and I get to satisfy each of those things and know that I'm working towards that. And so if you create that priority list and then set up your calendar to reflect those priorities, then you're doing a good job and you're going to be pretty satisfied.
Yeah, I think that's great because a lot of people want to talk about balance, but I feel like you have to have a very small list in order to allow that balance to kind of take place. Because if you have like 10 things you're really worried about, you're not going to be able to give 100% to every single item on that list. And when you're doing,
Yeah.
when you're training, you might be thinking about your work, or when you're at work, you might be thinking about training, and that's not going to help anybody.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's excellent. So the next question, what are some resources outside of weightlifting and strength training that you would recommend to our listeners that maybe have benefited you?
I so this is a resource. This will help training a little bit, but it's not directly in the training. But a really good friend of mine is a guy named Dr. Rob Bell, who's a sports psychologist who's done a ton of stuff with me about competition readiness and approaching training and all that kind of stuff. So that will help training, but it's not directly on the like sets and reps side of things. And he has like 7 or 8 books that are really good, all on Amazon. He's really good. I love reading. One of my goals in 2018 is I'm going to read a book a week. So I got 52 books that I'm going to read. So maybe in a year I will have a little more for you in terms of like specific books.
Mm-hmm.
But I love reading about leadership, character development. One book that I just started that I kind of started reading at the end of last year was a book called The Road to Character, which is really cool. So yeah, those are kind of off the top of my head, just like some nonfiction stuff and some things that might help you develop both your competition ability and your training ability.
Sure. And the last thing before we wrap up is you've developed a very successful business. And I'm not sure kind of how you view your business in terms of like where you want to go and where you're at now, but what would be some advice to up and coming gym owners or coaches that are looking at kind of what you developed and maybe aspire to reach that level?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that you gotta kind of understand is that like when you're in the coaching or personal training or gym business, you're actually in like the relationship business, right? So you're not in a business where like obviously there's like these metrics and numbers that'll be successful, but ultimately, right, you have to be good at creating good relationships with people and caring about people. And so what we try to do is make sure that we know that we're cultivating really good relationships with our clients, right? And so sometimes that means that we make decisions that wouldn't necessarily look like they're awesome for the business, right? Because it goes against our policy or something like that. But we know that this is probably the right thing to do. We should just do it because this, we want to support this person. They need it, da 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 da, right? So I think that's it. Is you're in the relationship business, and so the very first thing is like if you're a trainer or a coach and somebody misses a session, it's like if your best friend didn't show up for coffee, what would you do? You text them or call them and see what's up. Make sure they're okay. Not say, hey, you missed a session. Get your butt in here. It's like, hey, are you okay? Everything all right? All right, just checking in on you. That kind of stuff. Just little things like that are just and then you just build out from there, and you're creating really great relationships with a lot of different clients.
Right. That's great. I think a lot of people kind of view that relationship from the outset as like there's a power differential, but in reality, like as far as the athletes that I kind of work with, we're pretty much best friends. We hang out, we just chat about life. We just have a good time, and we make training fun so that we all want to show up. And the only difference is that like I write you a program, and I'm going to try and help you reach your potential. That's really the only thing that sets us apart. So I absolutely love that, Wil. And I think, that's probably why you've succeeded as much as you have, besides your vast expertise. Just talking to you, it seems like a heck of a lot about the sport and performance, and that really does show. And again, I want to thank you for coming on. Now, as far as contact information, where can our listeners find a bit more out about you and your products?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram at Wil Fleming, Wil with one L, WILFLEMING. And then my website is wilfleming.com. I try to write every week up there and post it on Wednesdays or Thursdays, just something technical or coaching related. And that's a really good place to connect with me. Links straight to my regular Gmail account. And learn from me and see my weightlifting cert, my weightlifting book, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. When I first got in the sport, like 3 years ago, so I haven't been training for that or weightlifting for that long, but I remember seeing a lot of your products and ads kind of pop up, and I was like, "Who's this Wil Fleming guy?" And it's interesting that it's kind of come full circle 3 years later. Bringing you on the podcast and kind of discussing training, and that's really cool. So, thank you again, Wil. I really respect your time and appreciate the fact that you wanted to come on. So yeah, that's it, guys.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you very much for having me on the show. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no problem. So that's it, guys. Another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. There's tons of great information within. So if you made it this far, I appreciate it. If you'd like, then you can subscribe. You can review the podcast. You can share it. Whatever you feel is appropriate for the quality information we put out. So thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you next time.